Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, whether that's on a stage, in a meeting room, in the living room, and everywhere in between. Welcome, my friend, to the very first episode of the newly rebranded podcast here. It's no longer the follow-up question. This show is now called, and you may have already seen this in your podcast player or wherever you're listening to this, it's now called Rethinking Communication. There's a very specific reason why I went through a name change and a rebrand of the show, and I'm going to get into that here in this inaugural episode underneath the new banner, the new name, Rethinking Communication. And then I want to get into some of the things that I was noticing that inspired the rebrand. So very quickly, why the name change? Why get away from my journalism roots in the title and the name, the follow-up question, to one now that is called Rethinking Communication? Well, it comes to this. I set out on this show back in 2020 to explore how we could use the power of questions to achieve common ground, to find common ground across some really nasty issues that are hanging out there in our society, in our culture, and not just here in the United States where I'm based, but around the world. How can we take the mindset of a journalist and apply that into our conversations where we disagree, where conflict is present, and hopefully, or my hope was at the time, find ways that we can uncover common ground. And I still believe that's the case. I'm not backtracking on that in any way with this name change and this reimagining of the show. I still believe that's the case. However, here's the rub. I don't believe, at first blush, we believe that we want that. When we find somebody that we disagree with, when we come against conflict, when we come against the perceived other side in an argument, especially about large societal or cultural or moral issues, I don't believe our first attempt at bridging that divide is made with common ground in mind. I don't believe we're stepping out with common ground in mind. And in fact, it is wildly hard to get people there. It's wildly hard to get people to stop and think, you know what, this person who I'm engaging with right now, who I really disagree with, who in fact I think they're perhaps an evil person, I'm going to stop and think about how I can achieve common ground with them. Over the last 4 years now, since this show has launched, that's a realization I've come to. It's so difficult to get people to stop and put themselves in that frame of mind before they enter a conflicting argument, a conflicting conversation. And so what I've noticed is that if I can backtrack to perhaps maybe some root cause issues of why that's so hard, maybe we can eventually get there at a later date. But leading with that message is really difficult and ultimately something that I don't believe most of us want, at least at first blush, like I said. I think we ultimately do want it, and I think we're ultimately capable of it. I just think it's really, really difficult for us to get there when we're caught up in the emotions of the moment. So, why rethinking communication? Well, if I go back to what I've heard in all of the conversations here on this show over the last 4 years, it has consistently come back to this notion that I have that we were never taught to communicate well with each other in our formal education, in our the traditional sense of how we were taught to communicate. It has all been this exertion of an idea, of an opinion, this I have to be certain of what I'm saying or else I'm wrong, and that is a really nasty, uncomfortable place to be. We were not set up well to understand the other part of extraction or of of conversation, which is the extraction. How do I get things out of people? How do I uncover those instances where we may agree? All of that said, that's what this show is going to focus on. The ways that we can get better at communication in those moments where, again, we want to inspire change. We want to make our voice heard, but also perhaps consider the other perspectives that may be at the table. I've always said, if you can understand the other side or the other perspectives, and it's not always a binary, but let's go with it. If you can understand the other side better or at least as good as they articulate their views on it, that can make you a better communicator in how you can communicate your views back to them, because then you can speak to the issues and the values as they see them rather than specifically and always as you see them. I've always said that, and that's been confirmed in the conversations that I've had on this show and in the many, many interviews that you've heard up to this point here under the banner of the follow-up question. But now I want to go deeper into that. I want to understand and I want to explore and I want to help bring to light the things that are missing in our formal education that make that incredibly difficult, that make the extraction and the ability to have those conversations when there is tension, when there is conflict. There's a skills gap that exists. So before I can even broach the topic of finding common ground, I've got to help fill in the skills gap that so many of us are missing. I do not claim to know everything, and so there will still be interviews here on this show. I'm rethinking things about communication as much as I hope to encourage you to rethink things about communication. Don't believe that just simply because I have my master's in communications or that I've been doing this podcast or that I was a journalist that I believe that I have it all figured out. This is as much an exploration for myself as it is, hopefully, for you under the new banner, Rethinking Communication. But I do have some things that I've noticed. I do have some things that I want to really dig into and explore and be open to changing my mind about, open to rethinking. But I want to bring you along on that journey with me. And I want to find the things I want to bring to light, I should say, the things that I'm noticing. And I want to just ask you, are you feeling this too? And to go back to something I think, getting ready to say earlier, so much of our communication education has been focused on certainty. And I want us to take the bent of curiosity. But again, there's a skills gap there. What does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that even mean? So much of our formal education was find the right answer and hold steadfast, and you're going to get graded on finding the right answer and be sure of the right answer. And I want to bring some nuance and complexity into this conversation so that we can perhaps down the road navigate those really uncomfortable, difficult, conflicty conversations. The episodes are probably going to be a little bit shorter. You're going to hear much more of me, not quite as many interviews, but like I said, I'm still bringing experts on, other perspectives. I still want to do that, and I still want to continue my mission of finding as many different voices and perspectives as possible on the issue of communication. That remains unchanged as well. We're just going to have that far more focused and not quite as politicized in some ways, emphasis on communication. So in the remaining time today, in this episode, I'm going to go through the 6 ways that school failed you when it came to communication. And these are the 6 major buckets that this show will focus on, episode in and episode out, moving forward. The ways that in which our skills gap, that I'm going to try and fill those skills gaps that formal education left you with. That's where we're going to spend our time here on Rethinking Communication. So the first way that school failed you when it comes to communication is the idea and the topic of emotions, understanding their role and how to acknowledge them rather than let them take over in conversation when we try to communicate with each other. And to introduce this topic or this idea, I'm going to read from you a portion of my book, Can I Ask a Question? Following your curiosity to shift the paradigm of communication, conflict, and change. And in the book, I write, ever been told to keep your emotions in check during a disagreement or an argument? Yeah, me too. How has that worked out for you? Because I got to tell you, advice like that makes me want to scream into a pillow. Emotions are natural, they're human, and they can be incredibly helpful in relaying what's important to you. Sure, they can be counterproductive when taken too far, but that doesn't mean you should stuff them down and pretend like disagreements don't affect you emotionally. When you disagree with someone about something you value, you're going to get emotional. The difference in whether or not emotions derail the conversation is how you acknowledge them and their influence over what you assume about other people. When your emotions cause you to attack a person and not their argument, that's harmful. When your emotions cause you to strip a human of their complexity and nuance and pare them down to an easily disregarded label, that's dangerous. When your emotions cause you to create entire conversations in your head about what you think another person believes, that's inaccurate. It's this concept of inaccurate disagreements that I go back to one of my conversations on this show with Monica Guzman. She wrote the book, I Never Thought of It That Way. And she described the difference or the importance of acknowledging, are we having accurate disagreements? Are we aligned on what we even disagree about, or are we disagreeing about things that are assumed in the other people? The things that we believe because we're so emotionally spun up that we begin to create these conversations in our head about what the other person thinks, believes, how they feel, how they view me, how they view the issue, where their beliefs came from on that issue, what's influencing them. All these things create a story in our head. And the stories that we tell ourselves in our head, when compounded with the emotional response that we have to those, when unconfirmed from the other side, they create and take on a life of their own. And so emotions become the dominating force in conversation rather than the actual disagreement itself. So when Monica asked the question here on the show, are we having accurate disagreements? She didn't say, are we having unemotional disagreements? Or are we acknowledging that we shouldn't be emotional? Yes, emotions happen. In fact, Dr. Leanne Davey, very early on in this show, in one of the early episodes, talked about getting underneath the emotions in an argument to what is this actually about? If you don't understand the emotions that play into conversation, and it doesn't always have to be, by the way, about disagreements. It can be about an important decision that you have to make, and you have to bring others along with you. Perhaps it's a really exciting decision to make, and there are multiple options, and your emotions play a role there as well. Perhaps it is, I'll give you an example of a way that it's not necessarily a disagreement, but I was at a conference earlier this year, and emotions on the keynote stage were extremely prevalent. Speaker after speaker after speaker on the keynote stage, the keynote speakers were bringing, in the name of vulnerability, bringing a lot of emotion to the stage, a lot of their own personal and in some instances very private trauma was brought to the stage, and their emotions came out of them in that moment. And I would submit to you that those emotions, when not backed up with an action item of what the audience or what the listener can do with those emotions and how they're supposed to process those emotions, that is what I call trauma dumping. That it is just this, in the name of vulnerability, dumping your trauma out on people as a way to just get it out of you. And we got to be careful about who's the audience to receive that. One of the questions you might ask is this person the right person to receive this emotion from me? In some instances, if you just want to vent, like Dr. Tanya Israel talked about on her episode, if you just want to vent, if you're just really mad and frustrated and you just want to get all your big thoughts and big feelings and big emotions out, Who is the right person across from you to receive that and to confirm or validate that in you? But if your goal is to get somebody to change their mind, if your goal is to get somebody to come along with you, if your goal is to affect some sort of action out of the thing that you are advocating for or advocating against, is the person across from you and the ways that your emotions are showing up to them the right person to hear that? So there's a lot that goes into emotions, acknowledging their role, acknowledging how they're affecting your view of the person. Is that person the right person to across from you to receive your emotions and be able to deal with them? And are we having accurate disagreements or accurate conversations based on the emotions present? That's one way that school failed you. We didn't talk about that enough. And it's hard because you can't test on something like that. Or at least it's really hard to. Perhaps we should be taking psychology courses should be perhaps more mandated in our formal education, but I digress. We're going to explore that. What emotions are at play in different types of conversations, their role, how to acknowledge them rather than letting them take over and consume the conversation. Next, school failed you in your ability to ask curious questions. Now, this is not a deviation from the former name of this show, the follow-up question. That will still remain true in this show. I will still take a curious mindset. Like I said earlier, curiosity over certainty. How to ask curious questions, not weaponized questions where we're trying to back somebody into a corner. And I think you know what I mean by a weaponized question. Well, you believe this, don't you? Well, you said that, so that must mean this, right? Those are technically questions. But you can hear the emotion in my voice as I act that out or play that out, and they're not curious. You've already assumed what you believe the answer is. It's weaponized. So how do we ask truly curious questions? That is the thing that I have hoped over the 4 years of this show up to this point that I have demonstrated to you in the interviews that I've done. How to ask truly curious questions. That's not going to change with this new approach. And I want to bring to you a book that I'm reading right now. It's by Charles Duhigg. You may know the name from his wildly popular best-selling book, The Power of Habit. I'm trying to get Charles on the show. So if anybody out there who's listening knows Charles, I've traded emails with him, but it's kind of gone cold right now. Anyway, I'm trying to get Charles on the show because he wrote a book recently called Super Communicators: How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. Kind of flows into what I'm going to be talking about here on Rethinking Communication, right? But in Super Communicators, Charles talks about the fact that the people who would be deemed centrality points in a conversation, the super communicators in conversations, whether it's one-on-one or within a group setting, ask 10 to 20% more questions than the other people present. And those questions don't have to be like what you hear here on this podcast. They can be as simple as the basics that we did learn in school: who, what, where, when, why, how. But they can, as Charles has said several times on other podcasts that I've heard him on, it can be as simple as, oh, really, why? Or what did you do next? Or what do you mean? Like, those are questions, but super communicators ask 10 to 20% more of those types of questions, those questions that are not laced with the assumption behind them. They're just genuinely trying to pull information out of people. That is something that super communicators do. That is something I'm going to continue to explore on this show, and that is a way that school failed you when it comes to communication. And it is the foundation of what I write about in my book, Can I Ask a Question? Asking curious questions of yourself, about others, and of others is the foundation of my methodology of conflict communication. And it doesn't even have to be conflict communication, but as I presented in the book, it is the ask then see approach to conflict communication. It is the ask, assume positive intent, set aside your ego, and know that you can't know everything. And then C, search yourself, Ask questions of yourself about what you believe, why you believe. In Super Communicators, Charles Duhigg writes, the most effective communicators pause before they speak and ask themselves, why am I opening my mouth? Now, how many times have you gotten in trouble by not asking that question and just opening your mouth, letting loose whatever came to your mind at the time? We can go on and on about our culture and social media and things like that and how it's fueling this. I'm sure we'll cover that more on the show in this topic. But that's the fundamental point of the ask then see approach is you first have to ask yourself some really deep, introspective, self-aware questions. Then you explore other perspectives. That's the first E in C. Explore other perspectives. Stay in your mind, but begin asking questions about others. And finally, the last E in C is exchange that curiosity with others. Go and find somebody who can enter into that safe conversation where you can exchange your curiosity with them by asking them questions to get a new perspective, to get a fuller, richer view of the issue, the challenge, the obstacle, the opportunity, perhaps. Again, I don't want to always default to the negative here, which is often what happens when I talk about ways school failed us when we come to communication and there being a skills gap, but it doesn't always have to be this conflict that we're trying to communicate across. It can be inspiring change. It can be drawing others to action. It can be capitalizing on an opportunity every bit as much as it can be how do we navigate through conflict. And that leads me into point 3 of how school failed you, navigating conflict. How do we navigate conflict? This is a lost skill, a lost ability as we grow older, as we get into our later years of formal education, the ability to understand how to navigate conflict because it will inevitably come up in our professional and personal lives as we fly the nest from our parents or wherever we live as adolescents. And I want to bring up a clip from Dr. Renee Carr and her episode here on the show. She had a really interesting take on conflict that I had never heard before when it comes to how we frame conflict and the opportunity that exists when conflict exists. So listen to this clip and then I'll come back and kind of wrap things up on this point. You said, I think conflict is honest because conflict states that we don't agree.
Yes.
Now, I want to give the full context of what you were talking about here, so I want to go on, but I want to come back to that. You went
Okay.
on to say, it can be healthy and good as far as outcomes if you're willing to acknowledge that we are different, but how can we come to a solution? But if your conflict is just conflict for the sake of conflict, then that would be maladaptive, non-productive, and that would not be good. We're just arguing for the sake of arguing. So
Mm,
Renee, I want to go back to the first part because I think that's really a really fascinating way to look at things. But I want to go deeper on that. You said I
okay.
think conflict is honest because conflict states that we don't agree.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it states that we don't agree. Sometimes we are egocentric. So that means we think that everyone thinks how we think, everyone wants what we want, everyone feels what we feel. And so by you having a conflict, it shows, okay, that person has something that's different in their thoughts, feelings, or goals or perception than what I do. And once we know that, then it could be a very mutually beneficial conversation by, okay, well, then what do you want? And it's not just all about me. We can discuss what our differences are, and we can also learn more about the other person versus thinking everyone is a mini me or just a reflection of me. So when you have conflict, it shows that you can have a deeper level of your relationship by recognizing that we're different, but how can we still move together forward in a way that's helping both of us?
Is that how we often look at conflict, though? I feel like we look at conflict as, "Ooh, this is a bad thing, and
Right,
therefore that person who disagrees with me or that I have conflict with must be bad or wrong or my enemy."
right.
Is that
So
how we
when you,
often take we don't often go into
yeah,
conflict thinking like that, do we?
yeah, well, so it takes a little bit more of a maturity for emotional intelligence. So if you think of like a 2-year-old, if I don't get a cookie, the world is completely crumbling and devastation, and I'm falling out and having a tantrum. When you get older, you recognize that, okay, well, cookie is not that important. So the same thing with relationships or conversations. If I recognize that we have a conflict as an opportunity for us to grow closer together, then you're showing a deeper level of emotional intelligence, of relational connection, and you're able to see whether it's a leader or a husband and wife situation. It's like, okay, well, now I can learn more about you and you can learn more about me. And by us learning what each of us is different in, then we can also grow closer and having more happiness levels and more fulfillment because we're actually helping both of us achieve our needs and both of us achieve our goals. And so, yeah, most people don't go into conflict if they are really trying to understand the person. They usually don't go into it. They're like, oh, if you don't agree with me, then you're this evil, bad person. But that comes from a very egocentric, self centered perspective and also reflects an area of where emotional intelligence needs to be increased.
This is fascinating. That conflict should reveal where we disagree and where we align so that we can build and work through that. And as you heard Dr. Renee Carr say there, an egocentric approach to conflict looks for ways that we are different. That's essentially what she said in that clip and what we continued to talk about in that conversation. And a self-aware approach to conflict looks for ways that we are similar. Now, think about conflict these days, no matter where it takes place, virtually, in person, anywhere. Do we approach conflict to find the ways that we are different and then force our view of those differences on the others to get them to acquiesce? Or is it a self-aware approach where we, again, and this kind of goes back to the common ground search that the show initially started out looking for, are we looking for ways that we are similar? Conflict reveals a lot about us, about our wants, our desires. It's been talked a lot about with many guests here on this show. But when you can, going back to the ask then see approach to navigating conflict and conflict communication, when you can set aside your ego, that's the S in ask, when you can set aside your ego and stop looking for ways that we are different and instead ask yourself questions, take that self-aware approach to find ways that we're similar, how does that help us navigate conflict? We may find that the things that we actually disagree on may be, I don't want to say trivial, but may be not insurmountable. Let's just say it that way. The fourth way that school failed you when it comes to communication is how do we build support? How do we drive change? And again, I want to bring back another conversation here with a clip. This comes from Michael McQueen, who has recently been on the show, that the foundation for any of this, how people change, what you're going to hear here is a wildly important thing that we miss when it comes to how we drive and build support for an idea, for an action, for getting people to change. Most of the time, from what I have seen, from what I've noticed, from my role as a director of marketing at a software company to helping people stand on a stage and deliver a message to other ways that I've helped navigate conflict and just taking a look at the world around us, how we most often try to navigate change is to make people feel stupid for their beliefs, to make them feel less than or inferior for their beliefs. And as you'll hear from Michael in this clip, that's never going to work.
One of the big things that holds any of us back from changing our mind is there's a bit of shame, a bit of embarrassment, sometimes a bit of ego wrapped up in it. So one of the big things is the unraveling effect. This idea that if I change my mind about this one thing, what else have I not been right about? Or I might have to rethink. And that can be like a bit of a worrying sort of prospect. You like say, I think that's the sort of loss that often keeps us bound up, that sense of losing our sense of dignity or self. And the moment that that feels like it's impinged on, that's when we dig our heels in. Even if deep down we know that what someone else is saying is probably right and would even benefit us, we'll still fight back. And we all know people that like that. You can actually present to them a reason to change that they're going to benefit massively from, and they'll still fight you on it. And you think, oh, isn't that interesting? So I think that I'm trying to unpack, and that's what I really wanted to look at in the book, is why don't smart people change? Even when they want to, even when they know they should, what keeps us fixed or stuck or rigid? And I mean, we're all susceptible to it, but I am mindful that temperament-wise or for whatever reason, I am definitely very much vulnerable to this.
When did that become clear to you? that it was this fear of loss rather than this fear of change that is in of all the things that you wrote about in the book. I'm going to sum it up as that we need to
Wow.
speak to the fear of loss rather than the fear of change, as we so often do.
Yep.
When did that become clear to you, Michael?
Well, I think probably halfway through the writing process, because I was sort of looking at there's lots of theories of change out there, and I think there's a fundamental assumption. I've heard it for years. I've written about it for years in previous books, and it's almost such an adage, a truism that we just assume that it's the case, and that is that humans are afraid of change.
Yeah.
And we've said that for so long, we just accept it as gospel truth. And yet every one of us knows times when like change was actually like as a breath of fresh air. It was as good as a holiday. And others around us was something about the way we positioned the idea that gave them the freedom to embrace it as their own. And you could just see the weight lift off them. So like people aren't afraid of change. So what is it that causes people not to change? And I think for me over the years, when I started to delve into this from a neuroscience and sort of behavioral psychology perspective, I started to think through the dozens, hundreds probably of experience I've seen of this with clients. I'd sit with a client and we talk about how things needed to change, and I would see that even with I could give really good reasons and all the benefits, and share price will improve, market share will grow, all the things that could be great and valuable, and still there'd be this, no, I don't want to do it. And we saw this play out in the culture wars over the last few years. I found it fascinating watching things like mask mandates, asking people to change their behavior and wear a mask when COVID was happening. And there was a really couple of really interesting pieces in the psychological press around the parallels between mask mandates and mandating seatbelt wearing decades
Yeah.
ago. And you had
Yeah.
people who were like, I will not wear a seatbelt. I would rather die like a free person than be told I have to wear a seatbelt. And eventually that changed and people embraced it, for all sorts of reasons. Often nudge theory played into it because that buzzing alert thing was so annoying. We just put the seatbelt on to avoid having the alert.
Right.
But they are just looking at so many things happening in society, certainly in my own client work. I'm like, there is something going on here. And I wanted to look at what it is that causes that point of resistance. And when I started to realize it is about a sense of loss as opposed to just the change itself, so much clicked. I'm like, that is so fundamentally true. I sense it in myself and I see it in others all the time. So it's funny, like what you've said there, like that was the thing that resonated most from the book. That's a common piece of feedback. And it was actually only something I popped in at the last 10% of the writing process. And I'm sort of glad I did, because it is obviously resonating strongly with a lot of people
Right.
right now.
Yeah.
Moment there's a sense that you think they're a fool, or that you look down on them, or even that you pity them and you want to change them as an act of rescuing, that people's dignity, they pick up on that straight away. Their ego kicks in and it's about defensiveness then instead of being open. So I think the challenge in all of this is, how do you change someone's mind, or get them to a point where they can change their mind without having to admit they're an idiot before they change their mind? And yet we often back people into that corner. In order to reconsider a belief or an assumption, they almost have to admit they were a fool in the past. And none of us like to do that. And yet that's so often what essentially we give people that option, and we wonder why they buck and they resist.
The underscored point in that clip from Michael is that trust is needed before change can occur. And if you are trying to approach change by proving me wrong from the onset, I am never going to trust you. Even if I agree with your core point, even if I agree with the data, the facts, the logic of your argument, if I don't trust you and that you have my best interest at heart, or the people that I care about, that you have their best interest at heart, change will not occur. Believe I've shared on this show one of my favorite quotes about change. It's by John C. Maxwell. He's an author, he's a leadership coach. And he said, people change for 4 reasons. They change when they hurt enough that they have to, when they see enough that they're inspired to, when they learn enough that they're able to, and when they learn enough that they want to, and when they receive enough that they're able to. And of those 4 points, there's one that stands out and like a sore thumb: hurting people to change. We've all heard the story of, and perhaps know somebody who received a terrible medical diagnosis or had a medical issue, and their doctor said, look, you've got to change your ways. You've got to eat better. You've got to have, let's say somebody had a heart attack. You've got to eat better. You got to start exercising. You got to cut back on this. You got to cut back on fatty red meats or salt or what have you. And they don't do it because it wasn't their decision. They were forced to change. They would rather stick to the decision that makes them feel like they were autonomous in making that choice than feeling like they were being forced to change, even when it meant the cost of their own life. We've all heard those stories, and like I said, you probably know somebody who has gone through that similar or exact scenario. So the other things that are important for us to build support for an idea or an action to drive change must be that we teach, that we inspire, that we give, rather than we try to hurt or force others to change. Because when we try to hurt or force others to change, we are never going to build trust, and true change will not happen. Nobody wants to be forced to change. It just doesn't feel right. So building trust, the ability to build trust, the ability to bring others along in a trusting environment to build support and eventually affect change was never taught in our formal education. The fifth way that school failed us, school failed you and me when it comes to communication, is the notion that listening is as important as speaking. We can think of all the instances where we had to write a persuasive essay, when we had to take a public speaking class, when were a member of the debate team or the mock trial team, or even when we had to give a presentation in class, that it was all about the exertion of an idea. I referenced this earlier. It's the exertion of the idea. It is, let me get my thoughts and ideas and opinions and perspective out there to you. You consume, and there's no extraction. It's all one directional. From me to you, I do not receive back. That's how we're taught. That's the style in which we're taught. You have the teacher standing out at the front of the room. And mind you, this isn't black and white. There certainly are teachers, professors, instructors who understood this and brought it into a more bidirectional approach to how they taught in their classrooms. And those, I would submit to you, are the teachers that were most impactful for many students, for many of us. Those folks, those teachers who brought us along in the exchange of ideas, exchange of perspectives, exchanges of experiences to teach about a particular subject. And listening is a core, a fundamental, a foundational element of that they were as willing to listen as they were willing to speak into somebody's life. So again, another clip for you here about just how powerful, how meaningful just having someone listen can be. This is from Orly Israel, again, another recent guest here on the show. He actually sets up listening tables, if you recall in that episode. And I just want to play of just Orly's perspective on listening and what he has learned in setting up his listening tables and why he wanted to get better at it.
They're missing someone to talk to. The people who sit down usually talk about how they don't have someone to talk to about this, or who the people they have in their life. Because I do ask sometimes when they're asking for advice or situations, or there is a lot of times where people just say, I don't have someone to talk to about this, in some manner or the other. And maybe they have a person, but not a receptive person, not a good listener. Or some people that maybe they are good listeners, but only for 10 minutes at a time, and the issue is more than a 10-minute issue. So I think people are missing those who have listening skills, those who have, not short-term solution compassion. Being a good listener, in my opinion, is a constant state of being where a good listener, as I teach people, isn't someone who says, like, tell me what's going on for you and drawing it out. Sometimes a good listener is able to facilitate that, but also being okay if the person doesn't want to talk about it right now, and letting them know constantly, hey, I'm here for you if you need me, when you need me. And it's not like, if you don't want to talk about it right now, the door closes. So to me, it's the practice of saying, the door's open. If you want to stop by, here I am. But I don't lose if you don't spill your heart out, because I'm doing the being a listener, which means whatever comes out is what I'll receive.
One of the episodes here on this show that I am most proud of is my episode on the misunderstanding of active listening. Because if we try to, what's the word? If we try to templatize listening, if we try to make listening a series of steps that we follow, we miss the point. And too often, I have felt that that is what active listening advice has tried to get us to do, is follow these steps as the listener so that you can give off this appearance or at least this notion of, yeah, you're going to listen. You're not going to speak as much. You're going to listen. And I think we all have been in a situation where somebody has tried to do that and it feels inauthentic, or it can feel inauthentic. To go back to a point that I made earlier about how to ask curious questions, that I believe is the way to listen. That is the entry point. That is the jumping off point of what it means to effectively listen to somebody, is when you can point your curiosity at somebody and ask them questions to get the depth of the thoughts in their mind to help them get that out of their head. That's your role as the listener. It is not to give the appearance that you're listening. It is to help the other person get the thoughts and ideas and emotions and expressions of who they are and what they value out of their head. If you recall Oscar Trimboli, who wrote the book, How to Listen, he's been on this show. He talked about 3 numbers, 125, 400, and 900. 125, our average speaking speed, 125 words per minute. 400, the average words per minute that we can listen to. That's why you're probably listening to this podcast on 2x speed, and you can still understand it. But then there's 900 words per minute. That's the thinking speed of the speaker. And so when I'm saying 125 words per minute, I'm thinking of 6 times, as many as 6 times more things in my head, more thoughts, more words, more emotions, more opinions, more perspectives, more ideas are rolling around in my head than what I'm saying right now. And as Oscar said, in high conflict situations or in high creative situations, like when you're brainstorming at work about an idea you're excited about, that can jump up to 1,500 words per minute rolling through your head. And you're only able to, on average, to speak 125 of those words per minute. So your job as the listener, if you know those numbers, help the person speaking get more of those words out of their head. And you do that by asking questions. That's what true listening, that's how it begins. It's not repeating and rephrasing something back to somebody, because if you get it wrong, that's frustrating. It's not nodding your head yes. It's not any sort of physical action that you can take to make it appear as if you're listening. I submit, and will continue to explore here on this show, asking questions is the way to listen, and what listening means. What are you listening for? That's what we're going to get into more, and what it means to somebody when they actually feel like they've been listened to. And finally, the 6th way that school failed you when it comes to communication: how to challenge your assumptions. This occurred here on this show and has occurred many, many times here on this show. How to challenge assumptions I've made. Perhaps you didn't know that I had an assumption going in. That was always my goal, but I've been challenged many times here on this show. But one of the ways that I have explicitly called out an assumption that I have was on my episode and our conversation with Robin Steinberg. She's a former public defender, and her book really challenged a lot of things. Her conversation challenged a lot of assumptions we make about who we would deem to be the worst of the worst in our society. Criminals, people who have committed criminal acts of their own volition, oftentimes, of their own deciding. And you'll just hear in this clip that I'm going to play from Robin. I'm going to challenge her with an assumption that I've made or a problem that I have, a roadblock in my mind. And Robin's going to challenge that assumption. She does it in a kind way. She does it in a way that is relatable and reachable for me, and hopefully for you as well. But I want you to hear this. So listen to this clip. Can I give you one of my but what abouts that I thought of
Sure.
as you were
Of
as
course.
I was reading the book?
Of course.
My thinking was, or my but what about, my mind went to repeat offenders.
Mhm.
The person who has 10 DUIs and on the 11th time getting in a car that we know of, driving drunk, he or she kills someone. My wife previously worked in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault as an advocate for those survivors. And just the abuse, the repeated abuse to the point where several times she had clients die at the hands of their abuser.
Mhm.
And the system itself that you're talking about did not step in at various points along the way to stop it. That's my but what about, Robin, are those repeat offenders where we know they're choosing to do something over and over and over again to the detriment of others, even in the case of others losing their lives.
So again,
I would love to understand.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, again, people need to be held accountable for the things they do that cause harm, and nothing about developing compassion and developing understanding and being curious about how somebody got to that position undermines that, right? That ultimate thing. Of course, people need to be held accountable, and of course, people need to be safe, and communities need to be safe. There's nothing about this that's magic. But what I would say is this: even somebody charged with something or repeat offenses like that, when they come into our criminal justice system, there is simply no excuse for treating anybody with less than dignity and respect, and honoring that we have a legal process, right? That we have to go through that does not have to look inhumane. It does not have to look violent. It does not have to inflict trauma and harm on people, right? To be effective and keep communities safe. But what it does say is that even within that system, we need to remind ourselves that the person we're looking at, who you might label repeat offender, you might label all sorts of things, is a human being who came into this world just like the rest of us did, right? And had a whole host of experiences, right, that got that person to that moment. And that's important to remember when we're trying to mete out what justice should look like, right? The things you don't know about people who get to that place, the things you're not curious about because you're so busy wagging your finger and labeling them and wanting to cancel them out of existence, might actually temper how we see the problem and teach us something for the future. And so it's always important, I think, as hard as it might be and as challenging it might be, is to ask ourselves, be curious about what might have happened here.
One of the most popular blogs or articles on my website is this article titled The Difference Between Opinion and Assumption. And in that article, I talk about how too often we believe that our assumptions fuel an opinion that we have, and that we believe that an opinion is evidence enough of truth. And we can go on for days about what truth means, capital T truth or my truth versus the truth. But there is a real, I'll say danger, I don't know if that's the right word, but there is a real danger when we allow our assumptions to take root within our mind that turn into opinions about what we think other people believe, how they feel, what they know, what they believe about us. And that becomes a truth in our lives. And once we have convinced ourselves of that, we go looking for confirmation of that truth in other people's actions, in other people's words, in the quote unquote research that we do. You know, you hear all the time these days, do your own research perhaps, or trust the science, as I've talked about. And that's all an outward expression of an assumption turned into opinion, turned into a truth for someone. And when we can get better at challenging our assumptions, and again, this goes back to curiosity over certainty, because in school you were taught, be certain, confirm your assumptions. Not a lot of us took enough of science classes to really understand, for instance, the scientific method and the fact that the scientific method is in a constant search to disprove what we believe to be true. And so it's actually a good thing when new evidence comes to light that says, you know what, that thing that we once believed to be true, or that we had evidence of up until that point, is now no longer something we believe. That's a good thing. We want that because now we're closer to what the truth is, and we did it by challenging our assumptions rather than relying on a specific moment in time of what the evidence or the facts or the data told us was the truth. We knew the truth up until a point, but in the scientific method, we continue to challenge those assumptions, those things that we believe to be true. That's a good thing. That's actually the whole point. And I want to bring some of that similar mentality into how we communicate with others. And that's what we're going to explore on this show. And that's what we were not taught enough about how to do in our formal education. So I hope this new direction takes root for you. I hope that you rethink some things. Certainly, I have wanted the conversations and the interviews that I've done on this show to challenge you, and I have heard from so many of you that has taken place. But I want to push more. I want to bring my own perspective more into this, the things that I'm noticing, and I want to call it out and just say, you know what, I see this. I'm wondering if you see it too. And I want us to explore that together. I'm going to continue to bring on guests, like I've said several times. I'm going to do a lot more solo episodes where I explore these topic areas. And it doesn't always have to be about conflict. It doesn't always have to be about finding common ground. Some days we may get into that idea of trauma dumping on a stage. How do we draw an audience to action around our vulnerability and our emotions rather than trauma dumping? We may get into very tactical stuff. And in fact, I know we will get into very tactical stuff like how do you bring a more fuller, richer story to a stage as a keynote speaker or as a conference presenter? We'll talk about leadership communication and how do you bring these same ideas and these same approaches into a meeting room or into a conversation with an employee that you manage, or even we all hear the phrase managing up. How do you bring it to a conversation with your boss? How do we communicate well in those instances and rethink our role in communication? And then, of course, the living room, the online space, culturally, how do we rethink our role in communicators, as communicators in those places and spaces? I want to thank you for sticking with me as we go through this name change. Give it a chance, please. I'm excited about this direction, and I hope you are too. And until next time, I'm going to keep ending it the way that I always have. Keep asking questions.